Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Chatting the Pictures. I'm Cara Finnegan, and I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I'm a publisher of Reading the Pictures. I'm also a psychologist and a writer.
So we have a little bit of all the different kinds of news today, right? We have political intrigue, we have tragic violence, and we have the ongoing parade of presidential candidates ahead of us. So shall we get moving?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this first segment is a segment we call the news, and this is where we ask a pretty straightforward question, which is how do news photos tell a story?
And the first image today is one you probably haven't seen because it was taken by a fantastic photographer. If you're not following him on Instagram, you should, David Butow. David's been working freelance and on Capitol Hill. So this photograph he published directly to Instagram. It was taken April 9th outside the House Committee Room on Capitol Hill. And David's caption reads, however things shake out, Attorney General William Barr, photographed on Capitol Hill yesterday, is guaranteed a place in the history books.
That's a really interesting caption, isn't it? It kind of points to the timely and timeless nature of this photo. Before we went on the air, Michael and I were trying to do a little calendaring because it was I got interested in the when this photo was made in the context of the way certain parts of the story have unfolded, and I think I at least read this photo in the context of kind of a few pieces of the story as they unfolded. So in late March, Mueller gave his report to Barr, and then Barr wrote the infamous short memo, which then circulated, and this photo was made before we saw the redacted full report. So between the Barr memo and the redacted Mueller report. And to me, that's, I think, important, and kind of portends maybe a little bit about what Barr might be thinking about his future, because to me, if nothing else, this is a photo about Barr and Barr's state of mind, I guess you could say, to the extent that, you know, you have the glance off screen, you have the furrowed brow. It's kind of a moment, a very private, I think, moment caught, but yet a very telling one at the same time.
It's really interesting, actually, that we haven't mentioned that, and for posterity's sake, because people are going to watch this in the future, that we are talking about this picture today because Barr testified yesterday before the Senate about his role in shaping, spinning the Barr report. So, but again, it's so interesting that in this whole cavalcade of craziness with this administration since the beginning, everything turns around acts, behaviors, personalities. Process has gone out the window. I think that due process, information is contextualized. And so I think this is the brilliance of not just David, but also the DC photo press, because, you know, if you watch them on Instagram, it may be the only kind of more accurate or real or realistic way of tracking this administration, where, you know, these guys are documenting the parallel universe through these very impressionistic photos. So I look at a picture like this and I'm like, yes, you know, paging Charles Dickens.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting you put it that way, Michael, because it's about character and the tone, and again, that caption from Butow is really interesting. It's sort of like, you know, to quote the epic Hamilton musical, history has its eyes on you. You know, and
wow.
this photo, the sepia tone of the photo, you know, which is something that I noticed and kind of thought about before we started talking. But as you mentioned, it in the context of, you know, this kind of broader epic narrative of this bizarre administration, you know, it is the sense of almost enshrinement of these characters and how we're going to be speaking about these characters and how these images are going to be a kind of chronicle of a kind of collective characterological study of all of the figures involved in this administration.
Yeah.
So, looking over his shoulder, others, the portraits, others looking over Barr's shoulder. Again, the kind of the cutoff of his face. It's like you're not seeing the whole story. There's all of these things. And I think the term you used earlier, impressionistic, is really important, because impressionistic does not mean a lack of information at all, right? It means a kind of density of what we might call emotional content of the photo, I think, from my perspective.
Yeah. I do like the little touch there of the security guy, which is also like a kind of maybe a little cue or code that something's wrong, but more so like what you've got here is the orderliness and this historical progression, a lineage of legislators. And you could imagine that you'd get the same scene in the Attorney General's office where, Barr is just one of, dozens of attorneys general over the years for the United States. And here you have, in such a beautiful way, you have this like deviation from history and from, again, how he's deviated from the Attorney General's independent role. Have you been speaking to the White House? Well, sort of. I can't exactly tell you. And then the fact that this askance view is like that he's got, like he's got his own agenda, or he's got a side agenda, or, all this stuff's going on outside the frame, which is exactly what's happening with this administration. So I really think it's brilliant in terms of how David kind of, encapsulates all that.
Yeah. I totally agree. A really fascinating study of this character and his character.
Yeah. Should we keep going?
Yeah, let's move on. So our next segment we call the look, and this is where we think about how news photos are making the best use of visual elements, or how a news photo might be pushing the visual boundaries in some way. And here's this week's photo.
This photo, it's a very powerful one, also taken by also like one of the best photojournalists out there, Mario Tama, who's been shooting for Getty Images for some time. He was in South America and Brazil for several years. He's back now, and he's based on the West Coast. The caption reads, Hannah Kaye, daughter of shooting victim Lori Gilbert Kaye, mourns at her mother's grave during a graveside service on April 29, 2019 in San Diego, California. Kaye was killed inside the Chabad of Poway synagogue on April 27th by a gunman who opened fire as worshipers attended services.
Tama's photo here is really powerful in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that initially strikes me about the photo is it is a kind of, it's built on that image of the Pieta, right? The kind of mourning woman. And to me, it invokes that sense, right? Of the mourning woman expressing emotional grief and loss. But to me, what makes this photo so especially powerful is that the daughter and the woman behind her, they are kind of encircled by the shovels of dirt and the movement of the dirt, right? And so you have the very specificity of what's happening with the shovels and with a burial. And at the same time, the way that Tama has composed this photo moves you past that and straight into the faces of the grief of these women. And to me, it's an image that you're both kind of on the outside as a viewer, and also you're just thrust right in to that young woman's experience. It's a really phenomenal photograph. It's
like the dirt. It's like our face is in the dirt, and literally, and you can see it in the foreground dropping from that shovel. And if we talk about how the photographs of mass shooting events have become so generic and so redundant, Mario has taken us like completely taken us beyond that, and you can really feel, because there's so much power, intimacy in this photograph. Her framed in between this, those two shovels. You can feel something again, even when 3 days later, University of North Carolina, you have still another mass shooting. But if you are Jewish and you've been to a Jewish cemetery and you are familiar with some ritual too, this also. And I don't know if Mario is aware of the ritual, but this is also like really, really powerful, because, the ritual at the gravesite, if in a Jewish death, after a Jewish death, each mourner takes turns doing one shovel of dirt into the grave. And there's all kinds of customs. They use the back of the shovel at first, which is to demonstrate reluctance. And then in some communities, the mourner replaces the shovel back into the earth rather than handing it to the next person, to indicate that wish that death isn't contagious. And then after you've emptied the shovel into the loved one's casket, now there's no denying death. So it's you see a transition that's in the photograph, and then which makes it possible for healing to begin. So those dynamics in this scene radiate.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And when you think about, and again, when you mentioned that falling dirt, right? So that it is
on both sides.
It's this is a photo that moves in multiple ways, right? I mean, it's moving in the sense of it moves the viewer emotionally, but it also is moving, and it's this kind of maybe to extend, your narrative about, what happens at the graveside. It's the sense of, there's always, the grief is always going to be there, right? It's not going to go away. And, and I'm glad that you mentioned the other shooting at UNC Charlotte yesterday, Thursday, because it also highlights the extent to which we have the whole narrative of mass shootings. This now seems like it collapses, and it could be just yesterday or it could be 2 days ago, but the regularity with which they are now appearing and being covered, and as you said, they have these kind of almost inevitable visual cliches attached to them. And a photo like this really stops you literally in your tracks and makes you look and think about things in a different way. And that just really happens powerfully here.
You're right. Actually, you're right too, in terms of like the cyclical nature, because both at the same time, this is like actually a cycle of life. It's also talking about like the secular nature. You start to pick up the kinetic aspect of this, and you start to see like the kind of cycle of grief and continuous grief that we as a culture are suffering.
Yeah, and the one last kind of element of this photo that really strikes me, you have the two faces of the women, and then there's the face of the man next on the right, whose face is partially obscured by a scarf, which in fact I think makes the picture stronger because it really forces you to look at the faces of the two women. But above that, if you sort of draw a triangle from the two women on one side, above that you have this hand coming down. That is a kind of disembodied hand. It's clearly someone in the background, and to me, it's like, what is that a hand? Is it a hand of blessing? Is it a reaching out? I mean, it's so artful, and the way the hand is physically moving is itself really artful. And so Tama has captured again that idea of movement and in this depiction of the trauma of the folks in that community and this particular person who lost her mother.
Incredible. Next.
Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Okay, so the last segment that we always do is called the pick. And here we are interested in what makes a photo an interesting editorial choice, or what are some images that kind of get a lot of visual traction in the cluttered visual public sphere. And so here is hot off the presses, this week's image.
Yep, this appeared just this morning on the cover of Time, obviously. It was taken by Ryan Pfluger, and the caption reads, Chasten Glesman and Mayor Pete Buttigieg on the front steps of their home in South Bend, Indiana.
You know, we talked about Beto a few weeks ago on the cover of Vanity Fair, and it appears to me that the open-collared blue shirt and khaki pants / jeans, etc., are kind of the uniform of the younger men on the campaign trail. So I'll just sort of say that there's a kind of visual theme happening.
The 2020 uniform, yeah.
Yeah. The at least the white guy uniform, right? You know, one of the things that I noticed first about this photo is actually the background. It's the background is linear, solid, and Midwestern. I mean, you've got the line, you know, and this is apparently a photo that was made in front of their home in South Bend, Indiana, as I think it says on the cover. But you've got, you know, the siding, and then you've got the porch rail with the kind of linear, decorative little, you know, porch railing features that many Midwestern houses have, and it's all painted white. And then you have the bricks, and that's very linear. And then you have the little bits of the daffodils and the tulips because it's springtime in Indiana. And to me,
so straight.
Yeah, it is telling us
normal
that this is a very kind of solid, you know, upstanding guy, and don't be freaked out by the male spouse, and don't be freaked out by our caption, which is first family. So, I mean, I don't want to undermine the radical nature of this cover, because it is pretty amazing and pretty incredible. Not only that you would have a very, at this point at least, very viable presidential candidate who is an out gay man who is married, but also to have that partner spouse be highly visible and engaged and really doing the supportive spouse of the candidate kind of role. And if you look at the article, you see that the article makes very clear that that's what Buttigieg's spouse is doing. So to me, what's interesting about the cover is this cover's kind of doing two things at once. It's saying, here's this new radical thing, right? This idea of a gay president and a gay family in the White House. And at the same time, it's presenting it in this very linear, solid, kind of stereotypically Midwestern conservative way. And I find that juxtaposition really interesting.
Yeah, and I don't think you're undermining it at all. In fact, I think what you're doing is articulating what Time is doing. I think this is an incredibly strategic and clever and provocative cover, where they are downplaying it, and all of that structure and all of that linearity and straightness, you know, in just formally, not to mention the daffodils. I think that's what they are. And also Chasten's checked shirt is just going for like all these tropes, you know, to like off the fact that, you know, we have this gay couple. And then I don't talk about anchor text that much, but, you know, in terms of the caption here, it wouldn't be the same. And when it says first family, it's not like a question mark after that, or it's not something, it's like, yeah, this could be our first family. This is like, this time has arrived, you know, and whether he wins or loses. And that is such a shot across the bow to kind of the battle for, you know, the Midwest and the base and the, you know, conservative value and everything. This is covers, you know, they've done it in a long time and totally on purpose.
Yeah. And, you know, I do want to highlight something about especially Buttigieg's face and his facial expression in light of the article itself. So the article opens with Randall Terry, radical anti-abortion activist, who apparently, among other things that he's typically up to, has been following Buttigieg around. And so the article opens with the right-wing kind of again, stereotype Middle Western threat that someone like Buttigieg potentially poses, right, in certain contexts as a candidate. And that to me is really interesting because even though you have, what we've framed, I think very rightly so, because I think we're very smart, as a really savvy, kind of interesting, positively framed cover, the story itself opens with this kind of anxiety and this sort of almost the scariness a little bit of that, right? Like the people who are really going to flip out, what are they going to do? And so I say that to kind of say that there's, little shadows casting across both of their faces. Buttigieg is not openly smiling. This isn't, again, as with Beto's cover on Vanity Fair that we talked about a few weeks ago, it's not the $1 million megawatt Obama smile with the beautiful teeth and all of that, right? It is a kind of, concerned, anxious, thoughtful facial expression, which in some ways reflects a little bit of the opening of the profile, which is, for whom is this guy going to really be a problem? And then why should we be interested in him?
It's the gaze is really confrontational and a bit defiant and maybe a little bit defensive too. The warmth of the of the embrace plays against that also. But this is it is provocative in that way, and it's really interesting how the tension, and I think that's really great that you framed that, because all the tension here seems to then kind of overshadow a lot of other things that are going on here. Like, for example, how otherwise you'd look at this as just this amazing generational statement, and this is an advertisement, a poster for generational change, versus a cover like this blows Biden out of the window, where you saw him, like the picture going around yesterday was him with the ice cream cone,
yeah.
And he looked like Jeb Bush or something. It's like, this is, this
could be one of Pizza's greatest hits, right? Yeah, I think that's actually a good point, right? So that we have them on the cover as opposed to who else, right? Who else was in the news this week? Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's also intimate, in terms of intimacy, they're newlyweds, they've been married less than a year. There's like a 8-year difference in age, still in his 20s. I mean, there's so many fascinating things about them personally and in terms of the relationship that we don't get to, because it's just the lightning strike, culturally, and and all that, how politics just kind of eats everything. And not to mention, I think you were also asking me, or we were talking about the other too, is just like, you said how many women that are announced candidates have been on the cover of Time yet. So then we've also got there is a gender factor in here also. So
yeah, like the young guys kind of seem to have the magazine cover thing locked down, and I have not gone and done a full survey, but the fact that we're talking about these covers tells you that they're high visibility, high impact, and that they do really interesting things for the way the public imagines candidates. And so thinking about who then gets to be visually presented and imagined in what ways and who doesn't, right? It reminds me of your really great piece in Columbia Journalism Review from last week on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? That she has become a kind of imagined figure and is playing out visually. So how are the women candidates, kind of playing in that space, or are they, or aren't they? It's an interesting question.
Well, I'm sure there'll be plenty more, certainly campaign images coming up in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. So that's it for this week, right? We're going to continue to be looking at all the places there are to look, and you don't really have to dig under rocks, right?
Look at the piece also that was in Columbia Journalism this week.
Yeah.
And you can find a link to Twitter feed. So yeah, we'll be back next week.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care.